ever since. But by the time I was in the 8th grade, I had been rejected for every team that you could play a ball with, because I never knew where the damn ball was. By the time it was close enough for me to see it, I was unable to adjust because the astigmatism caused me to believe the ball was here and it was actually going here.
Oh.
And so I was always the last guy chosen whenever you chose up team. So balls were my nemesis.
So when Dr. Haury came along with his ball court theory,
right.
And that's the one you really need to see, because if you got that in the head, you are in really big trouble.
Okay.
Forget concussion.
I'm going to make a loud
Fracture.
noise with my hand so that I can get a spike that then I can put all the soundtracks together with.
Okay.
And hopefully this will all hear this. And you're ready to go.
And we're ready to go?
Wow. Anytime you want to start.
Shall we introduce ourselves?
Certainly, that would be great.
It's May 29th.
March. We can start again.
It's March 29th.
Does she want to get out of
You're
here?
ready
See
to
how
get
interesting June 1. It's March 29th, 2013. I'm Beth Grindell. I'm the 6th director of the Arizona State Museum, and this is Raymond Thompson, the third director of the Arizona State Museum. Ray, tell me about how you got interested in archaeology.
Well, when I was a little boy, my father was a musician, played the trombone, and was very successful with a dance band. He was very creative. He would have King Tut dances when King Tut was found, and traveled all over the state of Maine with his band. And then Mr. Marconi and Mr. Edison entered the field, and lo and behold, nobody needed dance bands anymore, because you could put a phonograph record on, or you could turn on the radio, and you had music. And business just went boom. So he converted all of his knowledge about entertaining people in the state of Maine to booking carnivals in the summertime. And we traveled around all over the state, a different place every week. And then in the wintertime, depending on what kind of a deal my father had made for keeping us alive during the winter, we would stop at one of these places and spend the winter there. So I must have gone to 8 or 9 different primary schools or elementary schools in different cities in Maine. And since I was kind of a bookish nerd, I began to divest every Carnegie library in the state of its contents. And I got very much interested in Indians. I read Two Little Savages by Ernest Thompson Seton. And that was a wonderful thing. And by the way, Emil read that also.
Oh,
I was
did he
impressed
really?
by it.
Uh-huh.
And so I decided I wanted to be an Indian. And I read everything there was available for little boys about Indians in those libraries. It was quite a rich resource because Maine was still a good part of New England with an educational background and so forth, and people were encouraged to use libraries, etc. I remember I was running out of things about Indians, and one librarian, by this time I was about in high school, I guess I was a freshman in high school, one librarian said, well, there are a lot of interesting things on Black Africa, Indonesia, and I read a couple of those that just didn't come. So one librarian said, well, why don't you look at the travel section in the main library, the Dewey Decimal travel section, which I did. And there I discovered all these wonderful publications of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Temple of the Warriors by Earl Morris, Inscriptions of Petain by
And those were in the travel section?
They were in the travel section.
Interesting.
And there were also other things in the travel section where, people who traveled and reported on exotic things were also interesting to me, but I was fascinated by these publications. And by this time, it had sort of dawned on me that I was not going to be an Indian, but I could study Indians.
Was that a disappointment? When you
No, it
discovered-
wasn't.
No?
It wasn't a disappointment. I could study Indians, and the Indians I wanted to study were the ancient ones. And these publications just fascinated me. And many years later, I never had a copy of the temple. Many years later, when Liz Morris was a graduate student here, she gave me a copy of the Temple of the Warriors, and it's in our library now. But that I was also impelled in this direction by a very interesting experience. When I was about 13, the carnival one year was in Orono, Maine, which is where the University of Maine is, just north of Bangor, on the Penobscot River. And Orono is also the headquarters of the Penobscot Indian Reservation. And the Penobscot Indian Reservation includes an area around Orono and every island in the Penobscot River for umpteen miles going north. And while we were setting up in Orono, an elderly gentleman and his son came to the carnival and was snooping around talking to people. Turned out he was a Penobscot Indian who had made his living as a fake Plains Indian at rodeos and Wild West shows all over the country. And traveling around with the circus and carnival and so forth was in his blood. And every time the carnival or the circus came to town, he would come in and make friends there. And he made friends with me and chatted with me, and we talked about a variety of things. And so then he said to my father, why don't you let me take Ray to my island, and he can spend the week with me while you're here in Orono.
Wow.
Which I did. Well, it turned out that this guy had also been the major informant for Frank Goldsmith, who was the great ethnographer of Abenaki Indians throughout New Hampshire, Vermont, Quebec, the whole smear. Had a wonderful time with him. And that also, of course, gave me the idea I wasn't going to be an Indian, but I could study him. But in comparing that experience, wonderful though it was, and all these marvelous temples and painted pillars that were in the Temple of the Warriors, the old Penobscot Indian didn't win. Right then and there, I decided, yes, I am going to be an archaeologist, and I just stuck with it from there on out.
How did it come out how did it happen that you went to Tufts? Why was that the choice?
Well, I went to Portland High School. When my time came to go to high school, my parents decided that they should stop being gypsies, and that I should go to my sister and I she was a year behind me, that we should go to one high school for the whole time. And so we went back to Portland, where his family was. His father was a railroad conductor for the Boston and Maine Railroad between Portland and Boston. And during much of the Depression, they kept us alive, frankly. And so I'm going to Portland High School, which is an interesting place. It is the second oldest public high school in the United States. It was founded 1 month after the first public high school was founded in Boston in 1818 or something like that.
That's
impressive. It was a very interesting school. And I had some wonderful teachers. And in my junior year, a place called Tufts University decided that they were going to have a national competition, which was run by a man whom I got to know later because he was dean at Tufts, who was a psychologist, and he was a pioneer in the development of these psychological tests where they give you a bunch of triangles and hexagons and dots and spots, and they ask you what happens when you put them together and all of that sort of thing. And he had designed this examination that they would give in high schools all over the country. And I won it. So I had a 4-year free ride at Tufts University.
So this was designed as to see who could be the most creative developer of these various triangles, squares, circles,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Okay, that's terrific. That's
So
pretty
that was
impressive.
wonderful.
Yeah, that's
and
terrific.
it was really wonderful because my parents really didn't have the resources to send me to school.
Mm-hmm.
I had also applied to Bowdoin, to Bates, and to Colby, and the University of Maine,
Yeah.
the four places in Maine, and they all offered me something, student worker in the cafeteria, half scholarship for the first year, something like all of which was very good, but it paled against a complete 4-year scholarship at Tufts University.
Absolutely.
So I went
Absolutely.
to Tufts. And I didn't make the choice on the basis of what I wanted to be, because none of these places had archaeology, anthropology, or anything like that. And Tufts, however, had a very good geology department, and most of the people there were young men who had studied under Kirk Bryan at Harvard, who was the first big geologist in this country to cooperate with archaeologists. You may recall that he did the study of the Lindenmeyer site, which for the first time gave some geological evidence that man was here 20,000, something like that, years ago. And so these guys were all very sympathetic to the fact that I wanted to be an archaeologist. And when the time came, junior year at Tufts, you were supposed to go to a field school. Well, junior year for me, unfortunately, came after World War II, but they knew I wanted to be an archaeologist, so they said, well, we will accept, if you can find an archaeological field school you can go to, we will accept that, and you won't have to go study the Grand Canyon or the Rocky Mountains or something like that, which was what most geology field schools
And are
did.
interesting, certainly, in their own right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I wrote to the two places by this time. Another book that influenced, set of books that influenced, was Ann Extell Morris's Digging in Yucatan and Digging in the Southwest. So I knew that if you wanted to do archaeology in the United States of America in that period of time, hey, it was the Southwest. And the Southwest was Arizona and New Mexico. I wrote to both of them. And I got a letter back from Paul Reiter, who was at the University of Mexico. And he said, yeah, we have a field school. We'll probably have about 100 students, and I'll get in touch with you later. A couple of days later, I got a letter from Arizona signed by a guy named Emil Haury. And he said, yes, we have a field school. We're only going to accept 20 students. I enclose an application, and if you want to be considered, you better get it in right now. So you can imagine what I did. I sent it in immediately. By this time, Tufts had begun to think about anthropology, and they hired a man by the name of Frederick Wilson, who had been teaching at Brown. And he needed somebody to correct papers and so forth. And so I had sort of a student assistantship to correct his papers. And I got to know him a little bit, and so I offered his name as one of the people to refer to Haury. And Haury told me later on that one of the reasons he accepted me was that he got the letter from Wilson. Well, now, Wilson was a very interesting guy. He was the younger son of the family that made Baldwin pianos in Cincinnati. And like younger sons in these big dynasties, the older son took over the country and he was free to do what he wanted to do. He chased women all over the Gobi Desert, Central Africa, North Africa. I mean, he just went everywhere. And he lived in terrible conditions. And Emil knew him because he was in graduate school when Emil was in graduate school at Harvard. So Emil said, well, I knew that if he would recommend you, he knew what it was like to live in rough conditions, and that you would not give us any trouble at Point of Pines. So he accepted me.
So, and it sounds like you actually had some skills that Point of Pines could use that year.
Well, by this time I had spent 2 years in the Seabees, and they were still building their camp. So I chipped in on a number of things there. And I also learned a number of things. You know, that's one of the things about construction. New problems keep coming up, and in the new things that you do, you add to the skills that you have. So that was a lot of fun. And that's where I met the rancher's daughter.
Well, I was just going to ask, what really kept you in Arizona? Was it Emil Haury or
Well,
Wally Kendall?
I think the rancher's daughter was the primary motive, but Emil was the facilitator. Because that first summer, I can tell you that when that summer was over, and by this time I was on the GI Bill at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And the GI Bill, I think it was $85 a month we got. And I was able to rent a room near Harvard and pay the Harvard cafeteria for meals. I think I had $4 left over every month.
So you could splurge.
I could splurge. Well, it did give me, I saved enough money so that I could buy a railroad ticket from Boston to Globe, Arizona. But by the time I got to Globe, and I had to spend a night in a hotel in Globe, the Old Dominion Hotel, because Emil was picking us up the next day, I had one buffalo nickel left in my pocket. And of course, what I was planning to do would be to come to Tucson and find a newspaper and apply for a job and, you know, wash dishes or something and get a train ticket back to Cambridge and so forth. But Emil invited me to stay after the students left the camp and help close the camp, waterproof the system, and you know, all of that sort of thing, which was wonderful of him. He then took me to Tucson, put me in his house, fed me, gave me a job. Actually, it was more complicated than that. He gave me a job painting the interior of his house. I had been a painter in the Seabees. And then it came time to go back to Cambridge, and he gave me an airplane ticket to go back to Cambridge.
So he's a remarkably generous man.
Oh, yeah.
Or he saw something in you that he really wanted to.
Well, I'll tell you, I got back to Cambridge, Cambridge, and the next thing I knew, Emil offered me a job building the Ventana Cave exhibit, which I accepted, which gave me a chance to continue to chase the rancher's daughter, because she was the second full-time employee of the Arizona State Museum. Ted Sales was the first.
Really? I didn't
All
know that.
previous employees of the museum had been part-time, temporary, student, because, well, you know the whole business. You've got student credit hours for departments, and you've got the museum without student credit hours.
Yes.
So the money went to the teaching faculty. And so that was a good deal. And he sent me back to Cambridge, and the following summer gave me a job as a dig foreman at Point of Pines. And after the summer was over, took me back to his home again, bought me a suit, and a shirt, and a tie, and encouraged her parents that I was reliable, got us married in Tombstone, Arizona, and put us on the train to Cambridge to finish the graduate education.
So he wanted to make sure you retained that strong tie to Arizona.
I'll tell you, I did need that clothing, because by that time my sartorial level of elegance was, I was using up, to the extent that they were still in shreds, all of the old Marine fatigues that were issued to the Seabees, because that was the cheapest way of going. So
Yes.
I did not have the sort of thing that you would march down the aisle in a church in.
But those fatigues probably made great dig clothes.
They were wonderful dig clothes,
Yeah.
You know, the rancher's daughter was the magnet, but I'll tell you, Emil Haury was the facilitator. Very much so.
I knew him and was a student of his before.
Well, he was a man who clearly recognized talent.
Well, I
So-
don't know, but what he was very generous, and I've always been very grateful to him for it.
How was that? Beyond the thrill of meeting the rancher's daughter, how was that first season and maybe the second season?
Well, the first season was
Did it live
very
up to
good.
your expectations of
Yes,
archaeology in the
it
Southwest?
obviously confirmed all of my desires about being an archaeologist. And yes, that's what I want to do. And but prior to that, I had no idea how I was going to make it happen. You know, I was just going from one generous person to another generous person. And the second year at Point of Pines, I was a dig foreman, and that was very interesting. We had to expand the map of the Point of Pines ruin, which I did, and I discovered at that time that the maps were in terrible shape, so I redid all of them. So that was an experience that helped confirm my interest in doing the sorts of things you had to do as an archaeologist. It was a fun summer.
And so how did your permanent employment at the State Museum come about? It wasn't until 56 or 57, I think, that you got a staff
No, I was
position.
at the University of Kentucky.
Mhm.
And I should tell you how I got that job, because they don't do it that way anymore. I had completed the master's degree, was working on the dissertation, and looking for a job. This was the standard procedure for graduate students in those days. You finished your dissertation after you got on the job, whereas now it's usually expected you'll have,
That you'll have it done
the
first.
certificate in hand when you start the job. So one day I'm down in the basement of the Peabody Museum, and I get this message that Dr. Hooton wants to see me. Dr. Hooton was the head of the department. He had an office very much like this one. And you entered a door like that, and there was a chair down at the end, and as a student, you entered the door and sat down at the chair. Dr. Hooton would be down at the other end, behind his desk, and his classes were always like this, and he would be reading. And he would look up, "Hello, Ray," turn around, finish reading. He'd finish he might finish the whole chapter, you might sit there for 10 or 15 minutes, and he'd look up and he says, this is the entire conversation, "Ray, there's a job at the University of Kentucky, and you're going to take it." I said, "Thank you." That was it. I didn't know, well, I knew where Kentucky was, that was about all. I didn't know when I was due there. Nobody came from Kentucky to see me. I was not sent to Kentucky for an interview.
No interview. Mm-hmm.
Nothing. The physical anthropologist at Kentucky, Charles Snow, had become head of the department, and the archaeologist was retiring. So he called up Dr. Hooton, his old major professor, and said, "Send me an archaeologist." And that's what Dr. Hooton did.
Well, he knew who he could trust to pick out good people.
And it turned out not to be a bad job. But while we were there, Emil visited us. He became chairman of a series of seminars were sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation through the Society for American Archaeology. There were 4 of them, and he was made chairman of one of them, and he saw to it that I was invited to be on the panel for that group. I turned out editing and writing the report for it. He kept inviting us back for the summer to Point of Pines. Not every summer, because at Kentucky I had a 12-month job as half-time head of the museum and half-time assistant professor. I still had to teach 4 courses a semester, even though that was not exactly half-time.
Yikes.
And
That's a
so
pretty heavy job load.
every other summer I had to stay in Kentucky, and every other summer I would come back to Point of Pines. And
But that's set a tradition for you.
that set a very good tradition.
Yes, split
Emil-
between the academic and the
Emil,
administrative.
by this time, was beginning to get state government to agree to do something about destroying archaeological sites by highways and selling state land to looters and all of that sort of business. And he had finally gotten a position in the budget for an archaeologist on the museum staff, which he was trying to convert into a state archaeologist. And he actually offered me that job. But he told me that, I'd forgotten, it was not a terribly well-paying job. And by this time, Margaret had come along. So we
Your
were a little
first
bit
daughter.
concerned about money. And he says, I'd be happy to give you this job, but I'm working on something else. And if you'll hang on, maybe I'll have something else in a year or so.
Well, that was a leap of faith then.
That was a leap of faith.
To
And
hold back, not take the first job.
What happened is that this was at a time when American higher education had begun to break out of the slump at the end of World War II, and money was coming into the university. It was coming into the university at the time that Harville was president, and Harville had decided he was going to make the University of Arizona a nationally ranked research institution by building on the existing reputations of anthropology and astronomy. So every time Emil asked for something, he got it. You know?
That's
So,
fabulous.
yeah.
I'd like to live in that world.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yes.
So he got a job for some assistant professors. The job first went to Ned Danson,
Oh.
who was at the University of Colorado. And then Colton decided he wanted to retire from the museum in Northern Arizona. And he was experimenting with various people to bring in as assistant directors, and then they would take over. Things weren't going too well. He tried a couple of people whom he didn't want to promote to director. And he and Emil got together and decided that the person to do that would be Ned Danson.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
So Emil knew that this was going to cause him a little problem,
Right.
but he had a
so
get a way out of that.
Danson went to the Museum of Northern Arizona, which freed up the job at Kentucky, and Emil offered it to me.
Yeah.
And I've been here ever since.
So you moved from Kentucky to here. And so how did it come about that you became director in,
Well,
I think that was 1964?
yeah, obviously, Emil, I don't know what his plans were all along, but he and I had a very good working relationship, and I often did things that he would ask me to do that obviously were part of his job, and I enjoyed doing them. And then one day in 1963, he decided to take me on a trip with him to Las Vegas. And he was going to Las Vegas to inspect the dig that Dick Shuttler had at the site of Tule Springs,
Oh, yes.
the putative mid-Pleistocene camel hunters site or something or other. And Dick had this huge NSF grant to dig at Tule Springs and find out what was going on. And he had invited Emil up. Emil was his major professor. He did his dissertation on this. And so Emil went up there and he invited me to go with him, which I thought was great. I'm going to see Tule Springs. Well, on the airplane on the way up there, he asked me to take over his job as head of the department and director of the museum, which I thought was...
Did you have any inkling that
I
was
had
coming?
no inkling that something like this was happening. And he gave me a number of reasons for it. He would be 60 at the time the transition would take place. He had always been very concerned about his longevity. I think falsely, but nevertheless he was. His youngest brother, the youngest of three brothers, died during the influenza epidemic in World War I. Another brother died unexpectedly of some normal disease at a fairly early age, and another one died at a fairly early age, and I don't know what the cause. And his father died at a fairly early age. So Emil began to add all of this stuff up, and he was thinking, you know, I may not have too many years left to do something. He had always wanted to go back to Snaketown, and 1960 was the year he decided to do it. He got the largest NSF grant ever made for archaeology to dig at Snaketown. He also had in the back of his mind that the experience he had was Cummings was not a good one when the transition took place, because Cummings was very reluctant to give up the directorship of the museum. And the first day Emil was on the job in the museum, Cummings came in and sat down in front of him at his desk and said, "Now, Emil, let me tell you how we run things around here." And Emil said, right in the middle of that conversation, I promised myself right then and there I would never hang around after I retired and look over my successor's shoulder. And he never did. And he decided that one of the ways he was going to do this, he would go on this big dig at Snaketown. He would be up there for 9 months or whatever it was, and I would be down here sink or swim.
Right.
And after it was over, we would reestablish our relationship and everything would be hunky-dory. So he had all of these things that he was putting together to cause him to retire when he did retire. And Molly and I discussed it. By this time I'd had a couple of job offers in other places, and we had decided that we didn't want to go to other places. many people thought we were crazy because the thing to do then was to hop from one university to another. But we didn't want to do that,
Well, that's
so
still
we stayed
considered
here.
a good way to build your career and
Really,
your salary base too, so.
So we stayed here.
Well, and you had offers here within the university that you chose to turn down too at various points as dean, and even as, I believe you interviewed as for the presidency at one point.
Yes, I was stupid enough to do that. Before Emil turned everything over to me, he was given the opportunity to become dean of the graduate college. And he was very much torn whether he should do this or not. And I remember one time he came out while this was going on and had a big talk with both Molly and me as to what he ought to do. And he would have made a great graduate dean, there's no question about it. His stature in the university would enable him to, clamp a number of people down and knock a few heads together and get things moving in various ways that the normal person wouldn't be able to do. But he was also torn with the idea that if he did that, he would put anthropology and archaeology behind him. He would no longer be doing that.
Yes.
And that was something that both Molly and I felt strongly about, that if that's what you wanted to do, then you better keep on doing it. Because once you take one of these administrative jobs, all of that falls into the background, and the opportunity to go back to it is extremely difficult.
Harder and harder, yes.
And so he turned it down. Well, then when Dean Francis Roy retired as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, President Harville wanted me to take that job on. And I wishy-washed there for a while, and Molly and I both agreed, once again, that the key to this is, am I an archaeologist and an anthropologist, or am I a university administrator? And we decided I wanted to be an archaeologist, so we stayed here. Becoming dean of the, becoming a director of the museum and head of the department, I looked upon as a different thing, because there, at least all the paper that I was shuffling would say archaeology on it.
Yes.
The decisions that I would make would further archaeological and anthropological desires that I had. And that was a different kind of thing. Well, then when and I helped a broker putting President Schaefer in that position.
That's another process that's changed greatly over the years.
Greatly. Well, President Harville wasn't sure what was happening, but he wanted to see the program that he had to develop a major national research institution continue. And in fact, I had a long talk with him about it. And he asked me, what did I think of, back when I was playing the dean business, what did I think of John Schaefer, who was then head of the chemistry department? He was his second choice to be dean. And I told him that I thought John Schaefer would be a very good candidate. Well, then when it became time for Harville to leave and to be replaced as president, he asked me again, what did I think about it? Did I think that John Schaefer would be a capable person? And I told him I thought he would. I agreed to interview for the job. And I interviewed with the regents, and I just, I came out of that interview with saying that I want to be an archaeologist. The kinds of things that they were concerned about were just so foreign to my way of looking at the world that I just couldn't see that I would do that. But I agreed with President Harville that Dean Schaefer would make a good president, and I wrote a letter and got every department head in the College of Liberal Arts to sign it and send it to the Board of Regents.
That's an impressive feat in itself, getting a whole slew of department heads to agree on anything.
And recommending that they
indicates a great deal of political skill.
Dr. Schaefer very, very serious. And they did. And I think that was a good move.
Well, and so it is true that you determined not to become a big mover and shaker in academia, but you did go on to become a mover and shaker in archaeology and anthropology, far beyond the walls of the institution that
Well,
you were
I'm
director of.
not sure of that. Everybody
Well.
in that period of time, you got to remember that in that period of time, Beth, American education was exploding. You know, the GI Bill had finally done its job,
Uh-huh.
and the national government was not as insane as it is now, and education was still considered important. And so we had a situation where, particularly in small fields like anthropology, I don't think this was true in fields like engineering or chemistry or, you know, or even English literature, where you have large numbers of people. But in a field like anthropology, which was still a baby discipline as far as American higher education was concerned, there were not very many people around. You know, my cohort of graduate students at Harvard, there were about 30 of us, and we weren't all archaeologists. And so when you look at we're going out and getting jobs, and we're in a mature case in our jobs, there are still only 30 of us from Harvard, 15 from Columbia, 10 from Chicago, 12 from Berkeley, to draw upon for all of these things. Committees with the National Science Foundation, advisors to something or other, and that sort of thing. So we were all sort of, none of us sought this. We were all just sort of immediately faced with the job that if the discipline was going to grow, we were the ones who were going to have to do these things.
Well, you were also
simply because we were the only ones who were there.
But there's another aspect to that discipline too that I think you did also played a great role in, and I see when I look at that wonderful chronology that you prepared, which I'm now encouraging everybody I know to do, because I think it's a terrific resource.
Well, Emil did that, and I thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, it is. And when I read that, I really see a shift somewhere around 1970, 71 in your activities from archaeologically focused, shall we say, to more managerially focused aspects of archaeological preservation. And there's really this increasing emphasis on protective legislation. And of course, there was under Dr. Haury, there was the amendment to the State Antiquities Act in 1960. But then the legislation that came about in the 1970s, I really see building, when I read your document, I see that building throughout the 70s. And really, there was a growing national reliance on Southwestern archaeologists in particular to bring the issues of preservation and the legal issues around archaeology and the need to involve tribal people. Yeah. And I really see that growing, and it seems to me that you had a huge role to play in that.
Is circumstance again. By this time, the Antiquities Act was showing its age, so to speak. After all, it was produced at the beginning of the century.
The Federal Antiquities Act, yes.
And it was the model for what was going on in many states. And the nation had changed dramatically. So that there are all kinds of problems that the Antiquities Act just didn't solve anymore. And various things were being done in the federal agencies and in the states to patchwork things to make them work. And but obviously that wasn't going to continue forever. And a number of things forced the issue for the Southwest. For one thing, Emil was one of the leading anthropologists of the nation at the time, highly respected for his work at Ventana Cave, for his election to the National Academy of Sciences. He'd been very important in getting social sciences, including archaeology, in the National Science Foundation. His stature was very, very important, and that focused things on the Southwest. The other part of it was that the Southwest, because of its long history of activity in the area, had something to say about the past that made sense. It had a chronology. it wasn't still fumbling about when did the mound builders start, you know, and did the mound builders come from the lost tribes of Israel, or did they come from the Ottawa Indians or something? And in addition to that, the Southwest was a place where the archaeology was visible and already embedded in the consciousness of the nation. Because the Southwest was the place, after the Civil War, when all of these New England and Northeastern Army officers came out to take over the running of the West. Because the Confederates were not invited to do that. Even though the Confederates were settling out here, they weren't invited to be in that position. And these were educated people, and they wrote home to their folks about the Apaches in Chaco Canyon, and these things showed up in Atlantic Monthly and all of those New England literary journals. So the world was, you know, by this time there was even a cartoon strip about little Pueblo Indian boys and girls. So that the nation was conscious of archaeology through the Southwest. They weren't aware of that, but that was the way it worked. And so when the time came that people began to think of changing the law, a very interesting thing happened. An art dealer in Scottsdale, I believe, had a set of gun masks in his store for sale, and it was displayed in the window. And the Apache were very much upset about this, and at that time we had on our faculty the main Apache scholar in the country, Keith Masso. And they came to him for help, and he, without consulting with any of the archaeologists, decided that the Antiquities Act had a 100-year clause in it. And these gun masks, he claimed, may not in themselves be 100 years old, but they were typical of things that had been made for hundreds of years, and there should be covered by the Antiquities Act. This went to court, and they won. And the art dealer appealed, and it went to the appeals court, federal appeals court in San Francisco, and they ruled against it. At the same time, another appeals court in another part of the country dealt with another issue in the Antiquities Act, and they ruled the other way. So here we are with a law that's been in place for 50 or 60 years that's no longer functioning. The feds were unable to do anything because one court said another thing and another court said something else. And so the desire was to get a new Antiquities Act. Not to repeal the old one, because the old one has a number of things like authority for the president to create national monuments.
Yes, it's very important.
So we didn't want to repeal it, but we were sort of stymied in a way, because the place to do it would have been here in Arizona, because the person in Congress who was willing to push it through was Mo Udall, and he was chairman of the Interior Committee. But it was also at Arizona that the damn gun mask thing came up that screwed it up in the first place. So we didn't feel that we were in the best position to say, hey Mo, let's do something here. So the emphasis shifted to colleagues in New Mexico, where people like, who's the member scholar who was at Peabody now?
LeBlanc?
LeBlanc.
Yes.
Steve LeBlanc and Michael, who now runs the Archaeological Conservancy, got some very good lawyers to work on this. And they worked for a while and produced a very good draft. We cooperated with them and made suggestions to them. And ultimately, it was sent to us. They were getting nowhere in Congress. Nowhere. And Steve says in a publication, we were just getting nowhere until we got Emil Haury and Ray Thompson involved. Because we went to Mo Udall.
That's
and
said
Mo
in a
said,
couple of different publications.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mo is ready to go. He thought it was wonderful. Emil visited him in Washington. I visited him in Washington. The SAA met here that year, and the SAA passed a resolution to the congressman whose district they were meeting in, and so forth. And he pushed it through, bam, bam, bam.
Now, Steve LeBlanc also mentions in a 1985 article he wrote that he really feels that it would not have happened without you and Fred Wendorf and Charles McGimsey.
Well, that's entirely possible
Did
also.
the three of you set out to work together, or was that
Well,
just a
no,
happenstance?
we did work together on a lot of these things. We were all members of the CRAR, the Committee for the Recovery of Archaeological Remains,
Mhm.
which had been created in the 30s, or right after that period of time, as an independent four-person team of archaeologists to advise the federal government.
Mhm.
We're talking about a different period of time. Fred Johnson and Joe Bruce sat down and said, we got to do something about this
Mhm.
because the war is going to be over and they're going to tear up the Missouri River Basin with dams, and there's no mechanism anywhere for doing something about it. They had already had TVA,
Mhm.
and they said, we need to have
Tennessee Valley Authority.
TVA, the
Yeah.
Tennessee Valley Authority, where they did all of the salvage of those dams. And so they just appointed themselves. Believe me, they just appointed themselves. They got the American Council of Societies, they got the SEA, the American Anthropological Association, and I've forgotten the fourth organization, to agree to sponsor the four members of this committee. And they simply went down to Washington and met with federal authorities and members of Congress and said, you guys have got to do something. It was a very effective thing. And the federal agencies responded. Ultimately, Bob McGimsey and I were made members. Joe had retired, Emil had gotten out, and Fred was put on because of his role in the federal highway legislation as a liaison with the federal highway program. And we became very active. We'd all been in graduate school together, and we knew each other, and we worked very effectively in all of this. Bob McGimsey had been pushing for some way of getting the government to pay for all of this. It's one thing to say you got to do it, but how are you going to get the payment for it?
Yeah.
And so they got a ruling that 1.5% of every federal project had to go to archaeology. That was increased afterwards. But we were all working on different aspects, let's say. Fred in the federal area, Bob in the federal financing, and me on the Antiquities Act end. So it made for a very effective sort of thing. When we went to Congress or to our colleagues in the federal agencies, they knew that we were not offering them competitive things. We also knew, and we had learned this from Emil, that when you go to the federal government, you go to them with a problem and some possible solutions. You don't go to them with a problem and here's my way of doing it. Because those federal agents have got political problems, they've got personnel problems, they've got legal problems, they've got traditional ways of doing things problems, they've got constituencies that want them to do something else. You go to them, and we had this happen with the Antiquities Act and so forth affairs. In a number of cases, people would go and say, hey, this is the way to solve this, you guys got to do it. Well, almost always, some powerful congressman would find a way for killing it because that would interfere with one of his projects. So we didn't do that. We were always going to them with a goal. The goal is to protect archaeology, make these laws live up to the conditions of today and all of that sort of thing. So,
but to offer them alternatives.
We offered them alternatives. And ultimately some of these alternatives would not be competing, but would cooperate with one another and produce a more effective program. So, again, these were not planned things. These were, here we were a small group of 30 or 40 people in the country who were at the stages in our careers when we were called upon to do things. We knew each other well. The same thing had been true with Emil's generation. He was an even smaller group of people. They all knew each other. When something happened, in those days when something happened, they would call up and talk about it. They wouldn't go to Washington and sit down and discuss it. You didn't do it, no. You had to go by train anyway, you know.
It was a
But
long
they,
trip.
they would call up each other and talk about it, and things worked out very well that way. It's chaotic today because there are no clear channels by which we can go for federal action.
And many competing
And
demands
many competing
around anything. Yes.
sorts of things.
So a couple of people have mentioned to you that they've heard you talk about the golden mean from time to time. And so I want to ask what you meant by that, and did that influence this legislation, or was it something related to management of academic institutions? Or?
Well, the Greek philosophers, you know, insisted that everything should be done in moderation. Not that they did, but that is a strong belief that entered into our educational system in Germany and in England in the 19th century, and therefore also in the United States, where in both cases the worship of the classics, and particularly the Greek, was very strong. The Germans and the English were very strong. Now, Latin was involved and the Romans were involved, but the Greeks were the ones who were admired. And so this idea of doing everything in moderation got built into the educational system in a very serious way, so that people might me came along, and I was exposed to that educational system, and constantly you were being told about how, well, you don't accomplish things by going to extremes. You accomplish things by finding out what are the extremes and finding the middle road, and you can probably get that through. You know, this was just something that was built into the way we were trained, and I think that it works. So, we several times we talked some of our colleagues out of things because we knew that they would not work. The shipwreck guys were absolutely pissed off at us because we would not include shipwrecks in the Antiquities Act. We knew that if we put that in there, it would kill it because there were powerful congressmen who would not buy that. Okay.
So it speaks to a certain kind of pragmatism.
Pragmatic.
Yes.
That's what it's all about. It's pragmatism. And I think that pragmatism sort of has a dirty word because it means you're being practical, whereas moderation is a nice word because that you're going at it in a careful way. You know. So, but they're both the same thing. You know, there are so many examples in the political world where you have to go in between all of the hills where people are shooting at you. You know, you got to go down this valley to get to where you're going, and people on the hills are shooting at you. And you are not ever going to pacify all the people who are shooting at you, but you don't give them other reasons for shooting at you. And if it means that you've got to get this part through today and this part through 5 years from now, that's the way you do it.
That's the way to go.
That's the way you do it. You know, President Nixon, who was not exactly a friend of preservation and so forth, agreed to a very interesting thing. I can't say I had much to do with it, but several people in the federal government began to feel that we had these laws, and they said that this agency has to do this agency has to do something else, all agencies have to do this, you know, an absolute mosaic of things, and they were not getting anywhere. The guys in the Park Service who were supposed to manage historic preservation for the government had no control over the Department of Defense or the Soil Conservation Service or something like that. Somebody has to make this thing work. And so they sat down and they wrote this wonderful 1593 presidential executive order, which listed all of these laws and what you have to do in them, and had President Nixon sign it, wherein he says, okay guys, all you guys who work for me and all you federal agencies, here are these laws and Congress has passed them and you've got to live up to them and get together and do it, signed Richard A. Nixon. I'll tell you that was an absolutely huge step forward. He did not have any concept of what he was doing. But that was a starting point for getting all these people to work together. And once you got them working together, you have a very interesting thing. As long as the Congress did not tell the Department of Defense you have to do it, they were not going to do it. And once Congress says you have to do it, then they start doing it. They were frustrated also because all these other agencies were not cooperating with them. But nevertheless, the Department of Defense was very important because when they start to do something, they have organization. They say something, and every officer in the United States Army has to do this. Every administrator has to do this. So here Nixon comes along and says, you guys got to get together. Pretty soon, people are beginning to look at the way the Department of Defense is doing. Hey, it's easy to do it that way. And the next thing you know, every forest in the United States has an archaeologist on it. Every Air Force base has an archaeologist on it. You know, what that did for jobs was just incredible. And it simply meant that as far as all of us were concerned, that we had come out of a tradition where Emil and Joe Brew and Fred Johnson and others respected the federal government and its role in all of this, and took the position that taking a job with the Bureau of Land Management, with the Forest Service, is a respectable thing to do. And that's a noble thing to do. And it's something which will further the goals of the nation, and it will help give jobs to archaeologists.
Right, and it will take care of the
Whereas taking a job
Yep.
as a famous professor at some famous university and turning out more archaeologists for whom there are no jobs is not getting it done. These things have got to work together. The universities and the government have got to find a way of producing enough archaeologists to fit the jobs and producing enough jobs to hire the archaeologists, you know. Pragmatism again. That's what it was all about.
So Emil really had a big role
He
in
had a
creating
big role
sort
in
of
all of
public
that.
archaeology, if you
He
will.
really did. And he had that role in a way because he was respected for his pragmatism. Oh God, I can't tell you that. I won't stigmatize anybody, but some of our colleagues were absolute assholes. You know, they would insist that Congress has got to do boom, you know. And the minute it's out of this guy's mouth, you know that it's dead on the water, and Congress is never even going to read it, you know. But they would go around the country making speeches and denigrating everybody who didn't agree with them because that was not the right thing to do.
So they were very single-minded.
They were very single-minded.
And they got shot out of
And
the
they
water.
got shot out of the water
Yeah.
every time.
Yeah.
And but we still got a lot of them out there, I have to tell you. But Emil was very pragmatic about it. They sought him out for advice because they knew that he would give them advice that was practical, that would solve the problem, that would be good for the nation, you know, all of these things together, and that possibly might get done. And then he would work with them to convince key archaeologists or key paleontologists or key geologists to come along and support it. And that's how things got done.
And it has in fact created a much bigger world for archaeology.
Much bigger world for archaeology and a lot of other scientific disciplines. So,
Yes, this is true.
yeah.
Environmental impact statement, certainly, yes, yeah.
And yet on
Hold that thought. I'm down to a little over a minute left on this tape,
Okay.
so I'm going to stop here. This is a good chance for a bathroom break or.
Okay.
Anybody need a break?
Yeah.